Kame house. This week we're just reviewing the same things we have been reviewing for a while. Last week it appears that Zamasu decided to destroy everything and Zeno had to do a reset, so we didn't actually get to do anything. But now that Zamasu has been handled, relatively speaking, we get to continue with our usual. This is a loser stays on lobby. US East Coast 2. Ring match priority lobby 02. This is functionally a beginner lobby. Some people know long combos, some people have to work on their Dragon Rush tech. Lots of little things to talk about and do. We have been working on a specific set of things though, so you should pay attention to those whenever you can. I'll be playing a little bit more seriously this week myself, working on a bunch of spacing stuff that comes up from other games. More and more people have been learning that staying out of the way of your opponent's attacks is a little bit more important than actually landing your own. And of course, blocking on makeup. A lot of this is based on watching very carefully for where your opponent leaves themselves open. This is a lot easier in other fighting games. because most people can't move around as much, and their moments of being unguarded, converting them is a lot clearer than it is in this game. So this week we're focusing on primarily when a person is not guarding their head, when they're not guarding their legs, and those moments where they want to advance into a space that you have the capacity to attack, but can't attack on reaction. The last of those things is mostly about understanding when your opponent is likely to leave themselves open, rather than specifically seeing that they have this habit. Especially if you can keep yourself out of their own attack vectors while attacking the space that you expect them to be in. Some characters are better at this than others. We will call those the footsie characters for the purposes of this stream overall. Other characters can do it without caring that you have taken up their space, and that's usually what we will call zoners. Bardock is mostly one of the footsie characters. He has some zoning style tools, but if Bardock wants to attack you where you're going to be, he needs to get out of the way of where your attack is going first. Fortunately, he's relatively good at this. What he's less good at, and one of the few things that we can consider a weakness of Bardock as a character, is that he's not so great at converting those things, which is why he generally ends up on point or in the middle, because without help from his assists or others to get into attempt to extend his supers, he doesn't actually get a lot of damage off of those moments. He has great amounts of pressure, great open up potential, but he can't really hurt you that badly. You have to put a lot of work into that. But top players have obviously been putting in that work and are relatively happy with the character as he is. You can see, however, here that as a result, Kid Buu gets to bully him a little bit because Kid Buu has a lot more of that capacity. It's hard to get out of the way of Kid Buu's attacks, and therefore Bardock has a harder time opening him up in neutral. Kid Buu being much more of a footsie character, even though he doesn't have to get out of the way of things. Vegeta is generally another footsie character, as you can see. Once Vegeta goes into the air, locking him down and making sure you can hit him is really hard to do for most characters. But Vegeta can, at basically any time, attack any of the three spaces that he expects you to take up, especially if his assists are still available. If he expects you to come in under him and try to get something, he can always call pretty much any assist in the game that you would reasonably play alongside Vegeta Blue, and they will cover that space for him. We mentioned this in previous broadcasts, and it's still something you absolutely have to think about. Use your assist to cover the space you can't cover until you learn a bunch of assist combos. Especially if you are good at neutral in the first place, you will often benefit heavily from this simply because you are good at staying in those positions for so long that your assist will recharge, and by the time the situation has re-established itself or your opponent has given you a chance to do a combo, your assist may be back and you may be entirely able to use it for that purpose. High synergy footsie teams, such as Rune Siren, tend to have problems if one doesn't work on your assist timings first, because the opponent gets too much freedom of movement within the screen. So, again, that's our focus for this week. Movement and understanding where people are going to be. If your character has a good long low attack, usually not their crouching low because that doesn't tend to be so strong, but a crouching low medium, which is about half the characters in the game. You can also do this when you expect the opponent is not going to guard their legs for whatever reason. This isn't actually all that common in Dragon Ball FighterZ because people tend to either be on the ground and attacking or crouch blocking, or in the air and doing neither of those things. However, you can do it when you're surprising them, when they think it's time to block, but for whatever reason, they have not blocked in that direction. When you face an opponent who generally will not try to actually open you up properly, whose idea of offense is to just keep on hitting buttons, you are often safer doing this than any other option you've got. A lot of aerial movement will save you against this type of player because eventually they will get frustrated and hit something intended to catch you, and there's a good chance you just won't be there to be caught. So it's easier to control that sort of unbridled offense by just not caring and not being there in the first place. Frustrating this type of opponent is something absolutely required because you can make them both waste more meter and give up a lot of their screen space because they just can't actually get in. If they rely too much on getting in to do things, you will take some damage, but it takes a really long time for their damage to pay off. It's very important to recognize that in this game, getting hit a little bit, this really does not change that much about how you play it. You do have to be careful, however, that they tend to build up meter relatively quickly. And most of the footsie characters in this game can use that sort of meter very easily to get a lot out of it. However, do note that this style of play won't take you very far in most Dragon Ball because as your opponent's combos get better, leaving yourself open in these ways will lead to much larger combos done on you, and you just die rather than being able to do anything. Your ability to track your opponent is much more important than your ability to effectively stop your opponent from moving by hitting more and more things. If you find yourself losing in those situations where your opponent is effectively spamming by most standards, and this is an opponent you play often, it may be worth your effort to learn some longer combos based on the timings that you tend to land your damage against said opponent. So rather than trying specifically to beat them, watch where in your matches you tend to get a hit and see what combos you could learn that would be longer based on those hits, which will improve your performance at least against that specific person. There are also players who have very poor ideas of offense as a whole, making it easier to attack them than you'd think by using unconventional attacks of your own. Anything that will allow you to evade their general attack space will make it easier for you to enjoy playing against them, even if you can't actually win. In Omni Rabbit's case, for example, it's easier to just attack because he thinks it's time to attack on his own. You have to know what to do, obviously, which takes some time to learn, but you have a lot of weird options relative to where you can go and send your attack. Having long buttons with your footsie characters also makes it much easier to get out of the way of this sort of thing, and still manage to launch a decent counterattack. another way to win this sort of match. If you know your opponent's ability to attack is limited, you can actually time out in Dragon Ball without too much effort. But playing like this requires that you guard your legs better and more than most other players. Once you've reached this point, however, you really have a lot of trouble losing. So you can just play it lame and run away from your opponent most of the time, especially if your current character doesn't have a lot of good ways in on you. The strong back dashes that you normally find in this sort of character also help the matter quite a lot. Golden Freeze's screen freeze allows you to lock on to your opponent, so don't feel too bad about using it when you think you have an opening but can't be sure. Unlike most super flashes in the game, where your opponent's momentum will continue in a way that you cannot necessarily be sure of, Freeze's does not stop momentum, but because of the thing that he's doing at the time, it's much easier to see what the opponent's momentum at the moment was. You'll notice that most other supers move your opponent or focus your camera onto your character very early. If you have a character whose super does not focus the camera onto them quickly when they start doing it, you can use it in that same time-stop way to see what your opponent was doing and see what the appropriate follow-up should be. Especially if you have exactly 4 meter and it's a level 3, just if you would need absolutely to finish out and you know your level 3 can't hit, just go for it anyway. Unfortunately, not a lot of characters have this sort of super. As said, most of them do focus fairly quickly onto the character doing the move, and you really don't get to take a good look at your opponent's position. From the other side, if you're particularly good at playing neutral like Natakana or myself, you should learn to use your assists in your combos more so. Or to cover your unsafe approaches so you get more pressure out of it. You're unlikely to need them in that situation as much to cover a space on screen because you have such good understanding of the spaces on screen that your opponent is probably not throwing in heavy attacks at you constantly. Therefore, being able to use your assist for either pressure while keeping yourself safe in bad situations means you can build up massive amounts of meter advantage, as shown here. From here, Teen Gohan can basically take out the entire team. So even losing Tenshinhan doesn't really occur to Nadokon probably as a bad thing. It's too easy to just have Teen Gohan start off with this and treat himself as a meter battery, because he constantly rebuilds it while using meter. Almost instantly equalizing all of that. He's also a strong character that once he has meter, just like the same two you see there, you can't be absolutely sure that his pressure will go in the direction you expect it to. Sure, you can risk it, but you're taking more of a risk trying to get out than otherwise would be taking. Basically, give Teen Gohan enough meter, and he becomes a footsie character. Therefore, in this case, the strategic skill of knowing there is enough meter now for Teen Gohan to be dangerous, I can just bring him in, is a large part of this. But as you can see, Bardock can do tons of damage when he's gotten the right setup. He's not good at doing a lot of damage without meter, same as Teen Gohan, but at least you know in this team build-up that if Teen Gohan is lost and there is still a lot of meter left, the right sort of hit still means that Bardock will manage to finish it. This situation is a little tighter, but overall, strategically it favors Teen Gohan. It's a little difficult for Krillin, even with the Sparking Blast available, to force Teen Gohan into things. And as noted, Teen Gohan converts off nearly anything. Unfortunately, in this case, the Sparking made most of that combo get regenerated, and it was not possible to get Krillin low enough to threaten with a Vanish kill. So we move on to the next round of that type. The concept of measuring your attack space in fighting games applies to all of them, but not every one of them does it the same way. And furthermore, not every character within any game does it the same way. Dragon Ball FighterZ has definitely shown us that the game is mostly based around blocking until you see the correct space between you and your opponent and launching the counterattack. And your opponent gets the mix-up of, am I really vulnerable here? I have meter, I have an assist, I have some way of stopping that vulnerability from actually mattering. Therefore, I get to keep attacking and you don't get to counterattack even though you thought you do. So most of the rushdown characters in this game have that as their primary ability. The footsie style characters have a lot more freedom in, can I be attacked at all at this range? You know I have something I can use to stop you, but am I going to react in time? Would it be better for you to block and wait for me to do it? And all those things. But if you watch here carefully, you'll note Bardock keeps on moving to a specific space that makes it harder for Gohan to attack without putting himself into spaces that Bardock can easily attack. And the advantage you saw earlier was more so because of the early use of Sparking Blast on Rune Siren's side, leading to a potential change in strategy from the other side. It is now safe to throw out level 3s knowing that the damage from them will not be regenerated. Whereas in this case, there's a decent chance that somewhere in here, a lot of damage will be done in some way that will just be regenerated by Sparking. Understanding how to get in on opponents whose ability to measure that space and attack from those places is very high. It's one of the key things you have to learn in most fighting games, but as Dragon Ball Z especially so. You cannot just get forward on these people by doing moves because they have already measured the space that you will end up at if you use most of your approach moves. You have to walk. Or dash, but usually walk. While you can go from dash to blocking very quickly in this game, walking allows you to do the wiggle, where you basically cannot... The opponent cannot see whether or not you're blocking. They can't react to a dash and assume that maybe you overdid it. This forward movement also allows them to end up in your space where you could attack, rather than the opposite. Playing this sort of opponent will force you to be more patient in how you think about closing space, and more aware of the fact that in the end these games work because there is a limit to where your opponent can retreat to. Occasionally you will hear, not usually in this game, the term walking someone to the corner. This usually involves actually just walking. There are long sequences that are, for some people, relatively hard to understand as hype, where one top player has literally, in many of the standard 2D fighting games that are a bit slower than this one, walked forward and their opponent continually needed to walk backward until they reached the corner, and no attacks were really done on either side, at least not with any intent of hitting. Now Piccolo doesn't have the capacity to walk down Kid Buu. But 18 sort of does. Timing required is a bit much though, so... But you see, now that Kid Buu is in the corner, or was in the corner, Piccolo became a useful way to deal with the situation. Oh, that missed. Once again, you'll note that my opponent's response to being walked down is actually to attack, to have an instant action that if I were more prepared for it, I'd probably beat them on. I know that Runsaren's ability to stand still and just accept certain things happening is very low, leading to a lot of situations where I just gain advantage by walking forward. In fact, it would be in my best interest to just expect attacks all the time. See? So I could actually learn to respond to this sort of attack over this timing relatively easily because I'd get a lot of practice. Now, since almost all of my characters have a way to push you to the other side of the screen using just this safe S, they're even more annoying. It's not that this move is unavoidable, it's that once you're at a particular space on screen already, what you can do about it is really limited without putting yourself in a different space that I can attack. For example, I don't actually care about this because don't care about that either. The only thing that will happen is that my opponent will waste a lot of energy. To do very little. Similarly here, this is a relatively large waste of energy, even though it does a lot of damage to Piccolo, because Piccolo can just leave. The ability to just expect the attacks to keep on coming means you can, 1, practice your defense, but 2, feel a lot less pressured about your own meter. Your opponent builds up meter by continually trying to attack, but because those attacks can almost always be checked in some way, you shouldn't worry too much about it. All you have to do is get away from them or get them away from you, and the process will start over and your meter will rebuild.
Brace yourself for the coming battle.
This is not as true when both players are playing trying to get closer to each other. Even between relatively footsies versus rushdown players, as long as their overall intent is offense, the dynamic between them is a lot more about whether or not they can target the spot their opponent happens to be at on the screen at the end of a scramble. And it's easy for both sides to get caught up in this. They just look at wherever the opponent is on the screen and attack that spot, hoping that they won't move. You can beat them by being very mobile, but this only helps if you can actually attack from wherever you have moved to. Therefore, if that's your main type of opponent, you should work on being ready to react to them attacking the space where you were with your own attacks based on where they will be. You have to learn at least a little bit of the type of measured play that I was discussing in the other case. But you don't have to do it in the planning and thinking phase. You can do it by watching after your own movement, letting go of whatever your movement was, just knowing where you'll end up, and then attacking directly because you've been watching your opponent instead of yourself. You know which button you hit. You know where you probably should be if your opponent didn't manage to hit you, and if they did manage to hit you, you don't care. So your aim is to get out of the way of their attack, but watch where they are so you can counterattack as quickly as possible before they can recover, or even if not recover, get out of the way. In this game in particular, it's extremely important to make sure that you do not spend a lot of time expecting your single hit mid-range attacks to hit. The better mindset would generally be to expect them to miss, but then watch the space your opponent must move into to make them miss. Because you can quite often launch a secondary attack soon after, or just call your assist if they cover that space. Obviously, this is important to do as early into the match as possible when you have assists that are capable of covering the space in the first place. This is one of the few things that matters the most in terms of keeping all three of your characters alive strategically. If you are trying to play neutral with your character who is best suited for that, due to the fairness of the game, everyone other than Cell has to care about the potential vectors of their opponent. No character other than Cell, and to some extent Beerus, but with a lot of setup, covers every spot on the screen effectively. Which means it's always useful to know which attack you should bias toward. If your assists only hit grounded, then you should tilt your attack space somewhat toward the air and see if you can force your opponent to jump more, because your assist will cover the situation in which they don't jump as their attempt to get to you. If you keep on attacking upward, and your opponent thinks, I'm going to come in on the ground because you keep attacking upward, and your assist covers that, you can get all sorts of things off it. It's very important to learn to think of your assists at least as support footsie tools, if not anything else. They're not necessarily for defense, especially if you're playing long neutral. Plus, they're one extra thing on the screen that your opponent has to worry about, therefore they're distracting. And quite frankly, they don't recharge all that slowly, especially in the case where you're playing this sort of character. There are many moves that lock assist recharge, but for some reason most of the single hit footsie style moves in the game do not. For example, assist recharge while Kid Buu is chewing you. Therefore, you can massively increase your effectiveness by being able and willing to use them. However, note of course that they don't necessarily recharge while you're taking damage. So that's why they're so much more used by players playing footsie effectively than the opposite. All of the rules for when assist will and will not recharge can be a little bit hard to keep in mind, so just don't bother with it. Just get used to the idea that if you're doing things right, you will have them a lot more often than you think. And since some people are just good at buying a little bit more time than others, they don't worry about this. Vegeta Blue, for example, once he has his supports, he really doesn't have to care where he is doing his Big Bang attack from. He can do stuff in the air or on the ground. More so in the air though, because when he's in the air, he gets to cover a lot of space that way. Of course, bear in mind that switching also changes your assist recharges. So it's very important to realize that you don't just get to switch back to your good footsie character and immediately start using your assists for this sort of thing again. You have to have a decent plan in mind when you've decided a switch was necessary. It's also why it's useful to switch by doing your auto combo into super and similar things, because it will change the recharges on them. Certain assists can also be used when you feel pressured to move in on your opponent, when you feel you want to attack them to stop them from doing things. Depending on the assist chosen, you may be able to enhance your style in this way. In Rune Siren's case, when Gohan is in play, since he doesn't actually have a lot of good long-range attacks by most standards, it's fortunate that he also has the two assists best at attacking from far away and giving him some cover to get into his position. The opponent must go into the air to avoid these, and even going into the air won't always solve it. Leaving Gohan more free to do a lot of things.
Brace yourself for the coming battle!
If you enjoy strategy games, this sort of thing can often be for you. You get to think about a lot of things before the match even begins. For example, I failed there in the exact same thing I was talking about. If Kid Buu did dodge that attack, I should have expected him to be in the air. And if he's in the air, there are only three things that he's probably going to do. I could have reacted to at least 2 of those things. Fast. But not how quickly I have my assist again. Furthermore, look how much of my life ended up being blue health. Similarly, I actually have an entire specific reason why 18 is so useful to Piccolo. Piccolo can take care of himself in a lot of situations, but not so much against attacks like that. If you really expect your opponent is going to try to zone Piccolo out, 18 handles this fairly well. Once again, I'm making the mistake of believing that my opponent isn't just going to mash buttons. In fact, if I were more of a strong believer in certain forms of offense, as soon as I got close, the next thing to do would basically be to just deflect all the time. This is also important for setting up situations that suit you more in neutral, because you can deflect a lot of things. The difficulty is that Kid Buu specifically does not tend to be knocked away because a lot of Kid Buu's attacks don't count as close physical anymore. Note that linear movement is important only when your opponent does not have meter.
Brace yourself for the coming battle! Piccolo-san, 行きますよ! 覚悟はいいか。
どうした？逃
逃げられるか。
やれやれ。見えた。ちょっと脅してやるか。死になさい。ちょっと脅してやるか。しまった。任せてください。交代できますか。その程度ですか。ほらそら。クリリンさん。無惨状。おてい。兄ちゃん。甘いですよ。どうぞ。その程度ですか。交代できますか。そこですか。やるな。この星もろとも貴様らを待ちな。そこですか。そこですか。
早く勝負をつけなきゃね。どうした？加減が難しい。黙っときな。黙っときな。食らっときな。黙っときな。黙っときな。どうした？残念だし驚いて。まだまだ。勝たせてもらうよ。行くぞ。黙っときな。どうだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。食らっときな。やばいな。黙っときな。黙っときな。まいった。貴様の相手はこの僕だ。驚いて。食らっときな。
今度は俺が相手だ。覚悟はいいか。行くぞ。行くぞ。覚悟はいいか。やるな。
どうでしたか、ピッコロさん。クリリンさん、引退しても力は衰えていないな。僕も見習わなくちゃ。
Get ready for battle!
This brings us to the concept of the opponent approaching and getting hit by your crouch heavy. It's very important to understand what the range, especially the forward range, of your character's crouch heavy is. Similarly, how quickly they either recover from the move, or what they can do after it that would be out of the ordinary for most counterattacks. It's relatively easy to punish a Rift crouch heavy, but since you can often do it at spaces that your opponent is not expecting it, you can cause a lot of stress to them by using it as a footsie tool in situations that wouldn't otherwise make sense. Because it puts you airborne, characters who only do really good combos against grounded opponents can't punish you all that hard. And in fact, if your character has a particularly good crouch heavy for this purpose, you can spend a lot of time doing this. Frieza, on the other hand, is not so much good for this particular thing. Frieza's crouch heavy, while it is an incredibly good move, is not that type of thing. It does not put him airborne, it does not make the opponent flinch, and it does not confuse them very much. It looks like one of his other moves, just less horrible. However, it does have a really wide hitbox compared to most others, allowing him to stay really far out of the range of other people's expectations, while still just throwing it out there. Understanding which way your crouch heavy should be considered to work is very important for overall play. Some go higher than others because the character has longer limbs or is willing to put more motion into things, and some are more effective in other ways. Similarly, unlike other buttons that change their combo properties based slightly on how far away you are from the opponent, crouch heavy is fairly dependable. So if you learned a lot of combos based on it, even if you were past the point where most people were constantly super dashing at you, could still get a lot out of it if you managed to learn to use it in neutral in that particular way. Similarly, because they launch the opponent so high into the air and you don't have to move at all, it's very difficult for the opponent to say for sure how they need to recover or deal with the situation it creates. If you feel that the game is too fast-paced for you sometimes, it might be good to just hit crouch heavy just to get the space to do anything else.
調子いい。そろそろ本気を出しましょう。どうだい。もうここまでだ。いい次は助けんか。脅してやるか。
調子に乗るな。
絶対に許さんぞ。今です。
調子に乗るな。
どうだい。ちょっと脅してやるか。
And this ties into the thing I mentioned before with the expectation that your opponent will continue to attack. Crouch heavy from Frieza, for example, is a really good way to make people stop thinking they can move. Despite the fact that it is, compared to most super with punishable, it doesn't matter as much when the opponent can't be sure whether or not you intended for it to hit in the first place. So, just as Stand Heavy was a strong tool for these things, Crouch Heavy can also be a strong tool for these things, just in a different way. As you get higher and higher, your opponent will become better and better at tracking what this move does or means, or they will start doing this, trying to fight from farther away. But you must remember that a lot of the tactics involved in this game are based around annoying opponents into using their energy and meter and so on to make their own situation worse and yours better in the long term. Because with enough meter you can do things like that and turn unconventional ways of winning into the optimal strategy. But again, the reason why we took so long to talk about Crouch Heavy in these situations is because it's not universal. Not every character's Crouch Heavy has this sort of effect, and it's a little bit more character specific. Once you've learned to control other things, once you've learned where your assists will cover, when your opponent is likely to attack, how to force them to attack, that's when this becomes useful. Unlike Stand Heavy, which is just how far does this hit, and am I at that space right now? Most importantly, especially in the corner, Crouch heavy is actually a good recovery button for when you don't know what's going on. It tends to have a very long active period, and for most characters, it targets upward. So in those situations where you just happen to land first, but you know that your opponent isn't actually going to do anything, you can keep them in the air somewhat to at least create a situation you're comfortable with or understand, rather than waiting for them to land and then try to get out of their mix-up or whatever. Again, no, not for every character. Frieza has no use in doing this there. But Crouch Heavy is fast enough that in a lot of situations, you're more concerned with making sure that it is blocked. And what better situation for Crouch Heavy to be blocked in than your opponent is in the air and can't punish it properly anyway. It can save you a lot of confusion and even set up some call of assist or even your own switches. If you aren't sure that you can do it, you can't be sure which direction you're facing in to try to switch rather than calling assist. All of these things mean that that button can cover a lot of the situations you want to do something in but aren't sure what. Because it becomes safe against almost every opponent who spends a lot of time in the air. If your opponent is over your head, hit Crouch Heavy, because the worst that will happen to you is that you'll take a small combo, especially if your character is the type that goes into the air with your Crouch Heavy. If anything else, you can simply think of it as this: waiting for your opponent to land takes too long. And as you get more and more used to this move and the wonderful things it does, you'll start to see more opportunities for when it could be used reasonably for other things, not just recovery, saving yourself, etc. But if it feels as if I don't want to take this risk, this move is punishable, you can at least definitely start using it in situations where you're cornered and feel as if you're not really sure whether or not you're going to be benefiting from using it. Because in the end, you're probably not losing out enough that you have to feel terrified of trying. Over time, you will eventually get used to the idea of my opponent is up over my head, I'm probably safe doing this, as a concept you can just roll with. But once again, remember, not every character benefits from this in the same way. Most Crouch Heavy in the game are the same, but not all. Make sure that you understand whether or not your character benefits from hitting this move in those situations. And now the appearance of both Vegito and Zamasu. We'll give some time to talk about those characters. Our pre-analysis of this a few weeks back turns out to mostly be correct. It's just a game design thing. This type of character was due in both cases, and therefore what they turned out to be like isn't too surprising. Vegito has a lot of I can attack in any direction. He's lacking some of the Psylocke style things that I expected him to have. Or those things which I were expecting to be specials have turned out to be normals, which is even more surprising. However, it is good in terms of balance, because this means that he has less options for basic play and spends a lot more time in the Psylocke style of play, where you constantly see him moving around and attacking toward wherever the opponent will be in a moment. Zamasu, as expected, turns out to be quite the Magneto of this game. Not quite, but Magneto shifts a little bit sometimes. And he doesn't really need to be played like that. He does do a good job of representing that archetype, however, if you're familiar with Marvel. And will require a lot of learning of the whole fly, unfly, and so on things. This means that Vegito's actual game plan is complex compared to most characters in this game. Most characters in this game are attempting to hit you when they attack. Vegito's aim is not necessarily to hit you when he attacks. He's mostly aiming to get into a position that will lure you into counter-attacking, and then attack from that spot in a way that you can't counter. Master Zamasu, on the other hand, is a lot about his flight and various forms of it. But as you can see, we're seeing the standard forms of him demonstrated here. And again, balance-wise, he's not actually that suited to any of the other styles. He doesn't have particularly good foot keys. And doesn't have particularly good setups. He does have really good mobility though. And as usual, with respect to the lower, Metacon is sandbagging a bit, strategically speaking, because they're very difficult to play together. Shocking, really. While they are not necessarily characters that can only use a certain type of assist, you have to have a relatively unconventional game plan if you don't want to use a particular assist type. But that isn't to say that you can't do it. In short, Vegito benefits best when you cover the space that the opponent could threaten him from on his approach with an assist so that they don't want to do it. but that they still want to try to counterattack as soon as they see the opportunity, which Vegito then takes advantage of and swats them. Zamasu needs his assist to buy him time to set up his flight and similar things. And this is partially why they don't work all that well together.
The battle's about to start. Good luck.
Without these options, they're often forced to play relatively far away, such as when assists are down or they are down one character on the team. And this is true for both characters. Fortunately, they're reasonably effective from there, but for example, Frieza zoning can possibly give them some stress. It's just unconventional Frieza zoning because we're used to hitting like the far one. But there's a lot more of the other type involved. As you can see, he does have a counter, but that counter once again relies primarily on the fact the opponent is not mostly zoning. The same sort of problem occurs for Zamasu. He does have really good range on a lot of his normals, which is really helpful. But despite this, and the fact that even Piccolo's zoning is relatively terrible, you still have to deal with a lot of this stuff. Fortunately, the Vegito has a lot of speed in his normals, allowing him to do things that you wouldn't expect to be useful otherwise. You will note, however, that this is still very effective. If Vegito is moving away constantly, it's hard to say where he's going to be, and his quick normals will allow him to set himself up for longer attack strings like those. Once he is close to you, you don't have a lot of options in terms of what you want to spend your time doing. Which means you probably have to master your deflect game if you really want to put a lot into this. Well, once again, in the end, it comes back down to can you keep him away from you long enough to actually get anything? Because it takes him a lot more meter to keep up this sort of thing than it generally takes you as the player to defend it. So let's look more at how to deal with linear approaches. The first key obviously is patience. But patience must be considered by reactions. Your patience does not pay off if you don't have the reaction to make use of waiting for your opponent to do anything. You can see the benefit here for the same crouching heavy of certain characters. It forces your opponent to be more patient themselves. Once you have managed this and shut down a lot of their linear approaches, you have to rethink your own strategy because their thoughts will be in that direction. For example, this was bad mostly because I shouldn't have expected my opponent to open themselves up there. There's no real reason for them to do it. You have to understand the impatience of the opponent to be sure that was a good idea. But remember, above all, the key is that you must not try to hit the opponent necessarily on the ground with this same 5H, or they will generally be ready for you. You have to either aim to whiff it or hit from far enough away that they can't hit their own in response to it. Otherwise, you've basically lost the benefit of it, namely that it is relatively harder to punish. As you learn more and more about controlling your opponent's momentum and the linearity of their attacks, you can shift to viewing it as a binary on-off situation until they have come up with more methods. This is the path through learning fighting games for defensive players, or for players who are basing their game plan around stopping the opponent's attacks, even if they do so not so much by defending, but by intercepting constantly and understanding the opponent flow. As you can see, Brawly is another character where you have to be careful whether or not you're actually punishing what you think you are. The other thing you benefit from in this constant waiting for the moment to 2H is that you'll find yourself spending a lot more time watching for moments where your opponent might super dash, and you'll be much more ready for those super dashes than usual. Because you were already thinking of hitting the 2H anyway. Having that moment of, oh, it's time to do this, just pops in with everything else. That's interesting. In Frieza's case, it's more helpful because your opponent cannot be sure whether or not Frieza is actually in range to land his or not. If you are good at spacing yourself correctly, the max range of Frieza's normals is extremely disorienting for players because of the way that the game changes the distance from the characters based on how far apart they are on the screen. The same sort of thing happens with 18, but does not work on her heavy.
孫悟空を殺すために作られた俺の力だ。セル、俺に力を貸してどうするつもりだ。
It's time to face your opponent! It's all or nothing! Go!
終わりだ。行くぞ。覚悟はいいか。覚悟はいいか。
惜しかったね。逃げたく逃げてもいいよ。残念だったね。
次は助けんからな。
やるね。感謝なんかしてない。
覚悟はいいか。終わりだ。
こんなものか。
行くぞ。覚悟はいいか。終わりだ。行くぞ。
軽いね。こいつはどうだい。食らえ。もっと楽しもうぜ。そんな黙っときな。あんま似合ってない。黙っときな。なんだって。松井加減が難しい。黙っときな。いい加減にしてください。そら食らっときな。そら食らっときな。まだまだ。17の肩。いい加減にしろ。どうした。
俺ならどうだ。
獣め。覚悟はいい。無駄だ。こう見えても僕は優しい。いいですか。
はハンデだ。調子に乗るな。安いネーミングですが、ゴールデンフリーザとでも言っておきましょうか。そこですか。調子に乗るな。宇宙の塵にしてやる。宇宙の塵にしてやる。なんですって。こっちやろうな。この本気を出すまでもない。ビッグバンアタック。そこだ。こっちだ。やめるなよ。甘いな。
どうやらトレーニングは無駄ではなかったようです。さあ、そのまま命乞いをなさい。絶対に許しませんけどね。
The battle's about to start. Good luck.
The useful part of this is that both Vegito and Zamasu are good if you don't have to face zoners. So it's obviously in my best interest to switch to Frieza immediately and get what I can out of that. After all, if I eventually learn good enough defense against these characters, Frieza's ability to zone them out when they want to go to the other side of the screen will greatly increase my capacity to deal with them. And at that point, it just becomes a matter of the tactical decision of when to switch in someone else because the screen position has become favorable enough for that. Therefore, flow-wise, this match is all about when do I or do not need Frieza. For example here, realizing that if I finish I won't need Frieza again, I switch him out immediately with the super quad finish. But in this position, it's clear that I need Frieza again. More so against Vegito than generally against Zamasu, but still really needing Frieza. Now we're down to Goku Black, and I don't need Frieza as much. But now that I no longer need him, if he is the one who soaks up the damage from whatever high-level meter combo Goku Black does, it's better for my overall chances. Doesn't look like it's necessary today though. Learning to deal with zoners with these two characters, especially with both of them on the same team, is likely to be at least a relatively uphill battle. A choice of Goku Black or Goku as your third character to send out zoning attacks as assists and cancel out other things while letting you set stuff up can be really helpful. However, both these characters benefit quite a lot from having someone to start their combos for them in the basic situation. In those cases though, you're more so playing the neutral character as the main strategy and Vegito and Zamasu as continuations, and using a lot of your meter as you go to facilitate switches, usually when you have 2 bars, finish a combo, get back in the character that you wanted to do, and so on, since this tends to be less restrictive depending on what combo you have. Goku Black is capable of doing this task, but it is a lot harder because he tends to bring himself so much closer to the opponent while doing longer attacks like that. Fortunately, while Gohan, adult Gohan, is often useful as a zoner, he's not a very good zoner against either of these, so you can treat him as just another footsie style character from the opponent's side. Trunks in particular does not do that well against Vegito due to having the counter available and it being quick enough that most of Trunks' stuff will get caught in it. Even though Khan's usual play, it would be more likely at this point to use Zamasu in that space that was previously used by Beerus on streams before this one. As both King Gohan and Kenshin Han benefit a lot from having Zamasu around, and have good conversion tendencies, which are also beneficial to Zamasu. Zamasu can almost always land hits from very far away, but once he does so, it's relatively difficult to get a full combo without a lot of execution and a fair amount of luck in where the opponent's positioning had been. Whereas King Gohan converts off anything, so you don't care. Trunks' crouch heavy, as mentioned before, is actually a lot closer to Frieza's. It doesn't take him off the ground, it is relatively easy to guard, and it doesn't honestly have all that great pushback, but at least it's better than most, which don't really push you back at all. You shouldn't count on it to handle people who are directly over your head, or to create scrambles though. As you can note, without so many good normals to use, Vegito's pressure tends to be relatively linear compared to most characters. An interesting choice for his balance, honestly. Fortunately, he does have a good low. Even if good is a different definition than the good that most characters get. Unfortunately, with his constantly extending hurt boxes, it's hard to stay safe after doing normals in the first place. Meaning that people who are used to playing characters like Goku Black and so on, who got used to being able to count on those long normals and now just want a character with even more clean, close range pressure. They may be surprised that they can't use their normals to help them in the neutral and have to rely on specials even then. For Broly, this matchup is a lot easier. While Vegito does have a lot of multi-hit moves, and Broly's armor does work against specific types of thing better than others, Vegito's ability to keep the distance required or to fake Broly out is really minimal. Leading to quite likely a lot of suffering in the fact that you really just can't hit buttons against Broly other than the counter. But hitting the counter risks quite a lot. Fortunately, this is countered by the fact that Broly really doesn't have a lot of really good ways of dealing with the counter that don't involve basically doing his command grab. And as you can see, Vegito tends to spend a lot of time doing things, which is really good if you want to rely on assists for him, but not doing a lot of damage while doing that. Plus, the positions he puts most characters in while doing his longer combos don't lend themselves well to assists helping out. Therefore, we don't suggest him for players who want to do a lot of damage very fast using their whole tool. You can almost imagine Vegito telling me that he doesn't need any help. But it does work well if he does have enough help in the sense of the ability to call assist to save the situation. Therefore, let Vegito be the workhorse of your team, and just choose two really good assists to go with him that will help cover his positions. Similarly, as usual, Cell has decent ways of dealing with both these characters. Much like Beerus, they tend to drop onto the ground after doing something to keep themselves away from you that was done in the air. And with good timing, Cell can often hurt them at that point. And even though he won't get a lot of damage, it can be frustrating enough, especially with certain assists, that you don't really get to feel comfortable doing the standard gameplay. This allows the Cell player to build up more damage and more meter over time to use for vanishes, confirms, and so on, while themselves keeping a lot of their assist game going. Depending on which assists are available to Cell, this is really useful in a lot of ways. So now, as we are back to characters we're used to seeing, we'll go back to talking about Crouch Heavy and its very many powers. So once again, there are basically three types of Crouch Heavy. Ones that hit very far in front of you but not particularly well up or behind. How high up they hit tends to differ. These are not usually good in the corner, but are good for actual footsies. There are those that hit strongly upward, but don't take you off the ground. These tend to have good pushback, like Rollies. And despite the fact that you don't go airborne, they're harder than most to actually punish, especially if spaced correctly or used at the correct time. However, since they are slower and don't go up, they are not as good at handling people directly above your head. And the final kind is the kind displayed by characters like Piccolo and Android 18, where they are relatively quick, they do go into the air, and are harder to whiff punish. In fact, they go over nose altogether. And put the opponent airborne long enough that standard punishes or combos might drop, but don't lead to much after it, and have very poor forward range, making them terrible as footsie tools compared to most things in the game. You can see here that Vegeta's is closer to the 18 style, where if your opponent is not ready, they're not going to be able to punish it all that well. He does have a little more forward movement than them. And what exactly the cost of that is, we aren't even sure yet. He might just have that as an advantage. Vegeta's normals tend to be very good in this game overall. As with most short characters with short limbs, Goten's Crouch Heavy is not exactly the best for these sorts of things. Understanding exactly what to do with that one takes a lot more time. But you can still use it in the standard recovery way. So, of these three characters, the main things you need to understand are Vegeta can use his to catch other people. In multiple directions. Cell doesn't really need his, but when he does use it, it's more so for stopping attacks from the front and used at approximately the max range of it. In many ways, it replaces his stand heavy because he already has moves that reach far enough that you don't care about specifically using his stand heavy in those situations, but you sometimes need a quick normal that will gain you a lot of advantage, which Cell tends to lack actually. His stand heavy is a little too slow, and so are some of his other normals for getting things started. The strength of Gotenks on point is that he's able to handle nearly any character's style. His mobility allows for this. So to indicate how this works, I'm going to switch off of Piccolo so that Just Fine doesn't have to switch off of Gotenks for starts. And we'll actually get to see Gotenks do his work on point. Gotenks is able to move through and recover from so many things that he doesn't actually care where the other person is on the screen that much, especially not while he has two assists available to cover his positions. He's one of the few characters that can launch and attack with a very high amount of active frames out of his own recoveries. And this ability serves him really well in nearly every matchup, because you'd have to be so much less afraid of taking damage in the air, as mentioned before. This allows him to stay in the air for long periods of time, and yet react to nearly any approach or response the opponent tries to use. Being relatively smaller and harder to hit also helps in that he will not have to worry about being punished after certain types of attack style. He's also extremely good at that, you see. He tends to take so much less damage and puts himself in situations where the opponent is not trying to go straight for a kill, that if your intent was to use sparking on your first character, then he is the person for it.
手を抜いているのかい？そら黙っときな。たまに来るぜ。食らっときな。黙っときな。黙っときな。17号。
その美しい口を黙らせてやる。
食らっときな。行くよ17号。
わかったわかった。
はあ。やるね。頼んだよ。ちょっと脅してやる。
地球ごと消えてんだけどいいですか。
つながっとるだ。そこですか。しまった。
セル、生きてたのか。まだまだもっと楽しもうか。やるね。はあ。やる。黙っときな。
この程度か。
食らっときな。
せいぜい楽しませてくれよ。
驚いたよ17号。この野郎。そら行くよ17号。
わかったわかった。
やるね。
じゃあ少しだけ。
そう受け止めに勇気があるか。
無理しちゃう。こいつはどうだい。
貴様らガラクタ人形の出る幕じゃない。ナンバーワンはこの俺だ。
Brace yourself for the coming battle!
The start of a round is a good place to figure out what type of crouch heavy your character has. Frieza, for example, gets to hit crouch heavy for free at the beginning of rounds. Piccolo does not. But Piccolo doesn't need to do this because he has other options.
It's all or nothing! Let's go!
Trunks, on the other hand, is just like Frieza. He can just hit crouch heavy at the beginning of round for no reason. But part of what helps here is measured spacings. Knowing that because you were too far for your own crouch heavy to hit, your opponent was also too far for certain of their things to hit afterwards. For example, if Piccolo thinks it's time to hit his crouch heavy and is wrong, it's almost always time to hit this. Your opponent, therefore, can't just wait for you to hit the crouch heavy and do nothing. They often have to be more ready than that. 18 similarly doesn't benefit at all from hitting crouch heavy at the beginning of a round. And neither does Gohan. However, her stand heavy works really well for it. And she can just call 17 and solve the problem that way. In fact, in general, she's a character who can basically hit it for free whenever you think it needs to be hit to intercept something from your opponent. But if you don't feel like you need to do that, you're free to attack because of the way that her flow works. Either you need crouch heavy or you should be attacking. Because she doesn't cover that space where other people attack particularly well. If you think of what 18 can do that deals with people who are coming in from above her, it's basically nothing. Which is why it's so useful that hers doesn't actually go all that far or take all that long. The punishment for you attempting to hit this in neutral is relatively small compared to most things. Especially when your opponent does not have a lot of long normals to punish you for doing it. She can also use a lot of related things to move herself around the screen without thinking so much about it. And having your opponent on the watch for hitting that button also helps with your offense, because she has so many tricky ways of doing it. Since my characters are so good at getting over other people's crouch heavy, or just being annoying in general at long ranges, Frieza being able to literally clear the whole screen in a single bound when he wants to. Golden Frieza is ridiculous at that, and therefore can just be treated as a superhuman beyond all capacity of others to stop him from doing pretty much anything he wants. No one tells Frieza he can't get in. So bear in mind that all of this talk about 2H is only useful when your opponent doesn't have a different intention altogether. When your opponent is not trying to hit you, but is rather trying to move around you, your 2H stops being useful and you are better off with one that recovers quickly. You must also pay much less attention to what exactly happens. Fortunately, crouch heavy is super easy to confirm. If it hit, hit heavy again, and if it didn't, look for where your opponent went. Which means that your default should be to look for where your opponent went. Especially since you can just smash it. If it whiffed, it probably didn't do anything. You have to end up mashing for a particularly long time in order to find yourself doing something you shouldn't be doing after whiffing the 2H, whereas if you hit, the mash will work and it will cause you to confirm into Super Dash.
神も人間もない自分以外を信じないお前に俺は負けない この光さすところより消えよ
Zamasu, along with proper defensive assists, means that he can hold the space as long as he wants, and call in characters to help handle situations that he's not as good at. Those characters can then build meter to make him more effective, or just confirm into super to bring him back in at a position where it is heavily advantageous to do so. Similar to the previously mentioned, where Frieza is the one handling the zoning and the corner, and not the corner. This is also Zamasu's strong point. When you have to push your opponent back to the corner yourself, he's a good candidate for this. If you've already got them in the corner, you don't really need him. But if you know you're going to end up finishing off your opponent, switching him in doesn't always hurt. An early switch here, for example, would probably be useful. With his long punish normals and strong ability to kick the opponent around the place, put them in the corner, and then leave it up to his teammates again. All he has to do is basically land one hit and convert. Since in the corner he doesn't tend to get most of his good combos without giving up some of the advantage of the corner, it's easier for him to just switch into heavy damage characters, since he does not need meter to do most of his stuff other than the obvious main switch. Off the vanish, that is. Once you're back to neutral, as soon as he's available again, you call him back. Since his assist also covers so much space, your opponent can't just decide to abuse their own ability to stay out of the range of your characters. So he's always there as this basically perfect support to either get them closer, confuse the opponent, or take over himself if they're being particularly tricky. This makes him particularly good on teams where it's difficult to keep the pressure going after your big damage, because you know you have to go back to neutral or you're taking a risk. But going back to neutral gives you enough time to recharge your switch and therefore be able to either get your assist if you think your opponent is going to sit in the corner a little bit longer, or call Zamasu entirely to put them back there. Just look at that button. Technically not a button, but you know. Strictly speaking, it should be treated as one. He's also one of the greatest possible candidates for sparking. As he's able to completely avoid certain attacks for long periods of time. and is not very easy to catch in big combos because he doesn't leave himself open enough. Therefore, maximizing your effectiveness in sparking, because your opponent will spend a lot of time trying to pin him down, and use up a lot of energy, which he will just regenerate.
Get ready for battle!
And now back to discussing crouch heavy stuff. Trunks has basically no reason not to start the round against Broly with crouch heavy. None. Broly can hurt him, but Trunks doesn't care. There's not enough situations where this is a bad idea that Trunks just shouldn't hit it. This is because the knockback, the spacing, everything Broly does as a result of Trunks trying to hit that button has to be defensive.
Are you ready? Let's go!
You have to basically assume that Trunks will whiff that entirely. With a different scheme of assists, it would be relatively easy to further put pressure on Broly by whipping crouch heavy and calling an assist at the beginning of the round at the same time. This particular team is not so suited for it, but it is a thing you could do. There are even situations in which you could functionally get Krillin to help you do it. And just as mentioned before, with the stand heavy being sort of a mix-up with moving slightly closer and using Dragon Rush, crouch heavy has similar capacities. If you expect your opponent to use their crouch heavy, and therefore you stop in front of them so that you can bait it, they're usually in perfect Dragon Rush range. The Dragon Rush tends to be techable on reaction in that situation though, since you were probably ready for it. But they certainly haven't lost anything to try. Depending on their other options with their character, you may be in danger. But once again, not all characters are able to put up a threat at that point. But above all, the key is that once you feel as if you've understood your characters, you feel you understand how to use your assists, how to switch your supers, stuff about matchups, everything else we've been talking about so far, this is the next level. The crouch heavy will help you, and focusing on it will just make you more generally aware of where your opponent is, and how likely you are to be able to punish them on reaction simply because you thought it might be time. It's a lot easier to stand up to super dashes when you're thinking of crouch heavy as a natural part of your game, and therefore just something that happens when you see an opening. It will therefore become easier to see said openings. And with your opponent less likely to do certain things in corner traps or neutral, you can spare yourself a lot of stress. Understanding how your character uses their crouch heavy and what they can pull out of it, therefore, is the next focus you have. Never underestimate how effective that move can be against someone who is trying to put you under pressure, because the way it is guarded and punished differs from your stand heavy so much.
Brace yourself for the coming battle! Are you ready?
Next week we'll probably be looking at situations in which you can actually use switches or super dashes in situations where you feel as if you want to use your crouch heavy but you know it couldn't possibly be close enough. While this is a much riskier technique in a lot of situations, it does have the added use of covering any character who uses aerial special attacks. Basically, any beams or ki blasts that will bounce off you can be countered by this, whereas your crouch heavy would be likely to get hit. And since both of them are meant to punish the same sort of movement, the opponent going into the air at particular timings, you're still able to win out on it because you do not have to worry about this problem of super dashes where the opponent has usually seen it coming and prepared their own defense. This is a much rarer occurrence in matches, and only becomes easy to recognize once you have already learned the timings you might want to hit your crouch heavy because you expect the opponent to approach.
腰に乗り上がって倍になる。行くぞ。やったー。その距離なら行くぞ。オッケー。見切った。
But for now, we suggest, especially if you can play with friends, practice thinking of your crouch heavy as a footsie tool. And it will make it easier to use crouch heavy in defense. For certain characters, you can even just 100% of the time deflect immediately on landing from your crouch heavy. This is almost always only relative to characters whose crouch heavy goes upward and the opponent wants to wait for you to come back down in order to punish you properly. This is hard enough to do for most characters and people, especially if it whiffs entirely. But you can get away with just going straight for it. After all, you're going to get punished anyway if you don't deflect. And if they were in time to land the punish properly, your attempt to deflect makes no difference. At the range most of these moves leave you, even if you were to defend properly, i.e. block, you'd be in so much trouble based on the pressure potential available that you might as well have just gone for the deflect because you're going to get hit anyway eventually. Until you get really, really good at blocking and not getting opened up, it's probably easier to just go for it. For characters like Trunks and Frieza, after using it, your best option is usually to backdash or jump back as quickly as you can, especially against the sort of opponent who won't just punish you with their own. And of course, since most opponents can't just punish you with their own, it's easy to tell after just a little bit of practice which ones you should backdash from, which ones you should back jump from, and which ones you can just block.
The battle's about to start. Good luck! It's all or nothing. Fight!
殲滅する。そこだな。行くぞ。なんだ殲滅する。よしとした。リキッド発動。
生き残らず言い返しては返さんぞ。ちょっと脅してやるか。ちょっと脅して虫けら。虫けら。ちょっと脅してやる。虫けらがちょっと脅してやるか。
行くぞ。終わりだ。
ですよ。
甘い。
その程度ですか。その程度ですか。なるほど。なるほど。ここはお任せします。
立て直す。リキッド。行くぞ。
Similarly here, the opponent's tendency to respond to any movement with Super Dash is beatable. But it's much harder to execute than their option, which can leave you feeling fairly frustrated or disadvantaged at that aspect of the game. When you're faced with something like that, take your time and try to find a way around it rather than just obviously repeating the same thing and hoping that they mess it up. Once your opponent has proven that they can do something, don't go around testing them unless you've already exhausted your other options.
Showdown is about to begin!
What? お前から血祭りにあげてやる。
初めから全力でかかってくるんだな。It's all or nothing. Fight!
沈め。
終わらせてやるバーニ邪魔をするなこの攻撃だカメハメハどうかいさてしてカメハメハカメハメハ全力でいくぞまだまだ受けてみろどうした許さんぞよっよっ本気でいくぞどうした立て直すそこだな行くぞそこだな殲滅するどうした口に下がる見切ったなんのどうだそこだなしまった逃がさないぞ立て直す逃がさないぞどうだこの程度かそろそろそろそろ遊びは終わりだ殺してやる感情なんの俺は悪魔だなんの行くぞ修行の成果を見せてやるなんの行くぞ捕らえた修行の成果を見せてやる殲滅する甘いなもう逃げられんぞ甘いな逃がさないぞ生きたこっちだ逃がさないぞ問題ない俺が殺してやろうどこへ間に合って
As you can see, against many characters, especially if you are crouch heavy sending into the air, an unexpected crouch heavy can be followed by a deflect. Your opponent does not just get to punish that move for free. There's your second option. Since characters that are airborne after it can cancel it into Super Dash, a lot of the more obvious solutions to seeing that move, punish-wise, are defeated by this. This is relatively advanced though, as you must learn which characters have a meaningful response to it that can be undertaken instantly and which do not. There absolutely are some characters in the game who have a move that can just do it. However, once they've learned that you have enough mix-ups out of it, it tends to become clearer that they can't do a lot of damage.
A fierce showdown is about to begin.
Watch yourself against characters like Gohan, both adult and teen, Frieza to some extent, and Vegeta. also Vegito and Android 16. When you're worried about can I be punished for this without the opponent being able to do too much. But even this requires a level of reaction speed that is difficult if you add this in as part of a standard playing style. Once again, this is only really good for characters whose crouch heavy hits fairly high and has the capacity to hit late into its animation and leave you floating in the air. If you have another type, you need to come up with different ideas. Now lag has picked up like a storm today. Hopefully it will resolve itself soon. Of course, the benefit to this is that if your opponent themselves blocks the super dash, for whatever reason, perhaps because they don't have a good crouch heavy themselves to counter yours this, or that your spacing is really good. If your character has good mix-ups off of their super dash, then you've basically gone from trying to counter something and riffing into your offense mix-up. Vegeta is another character who's very good at this because he has even more options. Note the important thing is that in this case, the super dash method, the crouch heavy has to actually hit. This is a repair or a recovery from when you didn't mean to hit with it, but managed anyway, and your opponent happened to be blocking. This is different entirely from whiffing it and therefore having time to recover and use your defect. But it's just another thing to add to your arsenal, basically. This sort of setup was particularly helpful to Vegeta because of his aforementioned good Dragon Rush mix-ups. It's just adding one more layer to those. Despite Gotenks not being so good at this particular form of play, his other options still allow it to put a small space in there for when he's not able to use his aerial things against the opponent because they have good air coverage. It's easy to slide in on the ground and use the crouch heavy to give himself some space there. This of course brings us to touching back on what to do when your opponent is staying just out of range and preparing themselves for various things. Especially if you don't have a zoner. Even when you do, because not all the time will zoning be good enough to you, if your opponent decides to take a very specific spot on the screen, given the way that projectiles work in this game, most of us can't just launch an attack and be relatively sure that it will pin down the opponent. If they're really watching for it, they absolutely will be ready for it before you can do anything.
Are you ready?
So let's try to do this without zoning. Well, that's your first option. If your character has a good stand heavy, dash into stand heavy is often very strong. The main flaw of it relative to being just a zoning tool is that it's easier to counter or for your opponent to beat by doing something else. But you'd be surprised at how far this will reach. It will force your opponent to go into the air, which often breaks their I can react to anything response. If your character has longer normals than theirs does, you often have a big benefit from this as well. Forcing them to begin their own zoning game or get off the ground a lot more often. Once you've gotten them to do this, whatever it is that you wanted to do before is probably available again. So in Frieza's case, for example, this setup allows him to just do this all he wants. There are other benefits, of course, to making your opponent resort to their zoning tools. But those depend on your character. Mine, for example, are a lot less effective at forcing other people to stop zoning, without a lot of meter to do this sort of thing. But it tends to open up your ability to jump again. But Frieza, lacking with strong stand heavy in this case, is not able to make the same advantage of this. So, let's send Frieza back out. Let's see what we can get from 18. Since my opponent now no longer knows if I'm going to dash in and do crouch heavy, or do stand heavy, or jump, and use one of my many jump mix-ups, they can no longer count on that reactive skill that they were using. Needing to go back into the air and restart the entire rock, paper, scissors situation that we were discussing before. Depending on how much health and meter you have and how exactly you want to use it, you can make this whole thing work out much better for you. But be aware that in the end, if an opponent keeps on just hitting buttons, you're going to have to do a lot more work than them, because of the tracking on their super dash, making it possible to counter a lot of your approaches with it no matter what. At that point, you are just trying to get them to super dash at times when you could use your own crouch heavy to react to it. But we're going into the last match of the night. Join us tomorrow for very similar content but in Street Fighter, as surprising as that may sound. And on Monday for our Monday Mishmash Lounge, which is also Street Fighter practice.
It's all or nothing. Let's go.
Final note, if you're not too familiar with it, is how good a tool this is for just getting meter when you don't have it. Because the crouch heavy means your opponent can't do too much, you can build up your own meter, or if you don't want to go into the combo because you don't have much meter and can't get much damage out of it without it, you can wait for them to come back down, and I'll give you at least a 95% chance that at least in the earlier levels, beginners, you will be able to land a Dragon Rush on those people, rather than having to try to get the damage from this. However, you do still get a decent amount of life off them for it, and about half a bar of meter for just that little combo. So you can see easily that with just focusing on that, you're able to play a game that feels a lot heavier in terms of both interactions and damage, without specifically requiring you to use a lot of meter to do it. And on top of that, you are able to build up a lot of good conversions off of it when you do have enough middle. And it seems that for once Android 18 is giving the closeout for the week.
もしもっと腕を上げることができたらまた相手になってやると言っておいてくれ
Therefore, we'll be bringing our stream to a close for this evening. To MK, join us next week for more.